Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Caroline Moreau, and I'm an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this Global Early Adolescent Study webinar that will resume a number of studies that are published today in a supplement of the Journal of Adolescent Health, Exploring Gender and Health. The questions that we had at play were, number one, to visit the social context of young people who live in different communities around the world, understand their perceptions of gender norms and how they evolve over time, and ultimately understand how those perceptions relate to their health and well-being. But before I plunge into this study and present kind of the overall features of it, I want to recognize and dedicate this webinar and the supplement to our colleague, Professor Patrick Kayembe, who passed away last year, but he was a pilot of the Global Early Adolescent Study in his role as principal investigator in Kinshasa, which was the first site to launch the longitudinal research in Kinshasa. And Patrick has an incredible legacy in training a young, brilliant cohort of young researchers who have taken on this work, specifically Eric Mafuta and Aimé Lulebo, who are continuing this work in Kinshasa, and we want to honor his memory today. So to give you a little bit of perspective about the data that we are presenting today, the Global Early Adolescent Study is a multi-site, multi-country study that takes place in, the data that we're presenting today takes place in 7 sites, but actually the Global Early Adolescent Study expands to 11 sites around the world. And we focus on urban poor adolescents between the ages of 10 and 14 when they are recruited into this study. The data that we will be presenting today relate to Belgium, Kinshasa, Ecuador, Shanghai, and Indonesia. One of the important features of this study is to really understand how young people perceive gender norms and specifically unequal norms or expectations about how boys or girls should behave. And to do that, we developed instruments that are really based on formative research, qualitative research that was conducted around the world in 14 sites. And we landed on 3 measures that were validated in the study related to different dimensions of gender as it relates to relationships, traits, or roles. So the first one, called SDS for sexual double standard, pretty much portrays or reflects the fact that boys are rewarded for engaging in romantic and sexual relationships, while the opposite is true for girls. The second dimensions relates to gender stereotypical traits, GST, and portrays boys as tough versus girls as vulnerable. And the third one, the gender stereotypical roles, GSR, relates to unequal power in households and decision-making in households, valuing boys or men over women. And so you will see those dimensions that are used throughout the results that we will be presenting. So now, with further ado, I really want to introduce our speakers today, starting with Kristen Mari, who will set the stage and talk about the social context in which young people live across these different sites. And then we will move on to Ben Sislagi, who is Kristen is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Next, we will invite Ben Sislagi, who's an associate professor at the London School of Tropical or Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Ben will talk about young people's perceptions of these different gender norms and specifically how they change over time in one site in Kinshasa that has longitudinal data. Next, we will invite Asta Ramia, who's a research scientist at Hopkins, who will talk about how those gender perceptions relate to health behaviors and health outcomes in the form of violence perpetration and depressive symptoms. And finally, we will ask Bob Blum, who's a professor at Hopkins and who's actually the principal investigator of the Global Early Adolescent Study, to reflect on how gender norms relate to body satisfaction and agency. Next, we will invite Elizabeth Sawick, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia in the School of Nursing, and to make some concluding remarks, as she was the guest editor of this supplement. So we will hear from her. And finally, we will open it up for Q&A. So I invite all of you to post questions in the Q&A box as we go along so that we can address your questions while we move through the presentations and that at the very end. So with no further ado, Kristen, you have the mic, and I will make the slides move when you say next.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Caroline, for that great introduction. So as Caroline mentioned, this presentation is going to set the stage for a lot of the findings you're going to hear following this. So the main objectives of this analysis was really to provide a description of the social context of these urban adolescents in this global early adolescent study and how they might vary, how these social contexts vary by sex across these different contexts. Again, all within the construct of this large study. And just to point out that this analysis was organized by the socio-ecological model. So we're looking at these social contexts by family, by neighborhood, et cetera. So to point that out. So next slide. So starting with the family, one of the overarching findings that we found was that actually most adolescents in our study in this age group are living in two-parent households, and they actually felt close and cared for by their caregivers and felt that their caregivers also monitored them, knew where they were, knew where their friends were. However, there were some site differences and gender differences. So in Cuenca and Kinshasa, there were substantial proportions of adolescents who did not live in a two-parent household. So they either lived in single-parent or non-parented households, particularly in Kinshasa. And this was largely attributed to out-migration, especially for the fathers, for economic purposes in both of those sites. But then when we look at the parental monitoring, again, this is asking adolescents their perceptions of how well their parents know about where they are and what their friends are. And you can see that in every single site, we found that there were big gender differences, whereas girls were perceived that their parents were much more aware of their whereabouts and their friends than boys were. Next slide. So then we turn to the peer environment. And as you know, in this age group, this is when peers start to have a much more influential role in their lives. And here we find that girls spend far less time with their friends than boys do. And we also found that girls were more likely to have friends that were the same sex compared to boys. And this has important implications because we know that peers are an important source for gender interactions. That's how they learn about gender norms and roles. And so these sex differences in these peer networks may be really important as we think about how these gender attitudes and beliefs are being formed. So next slide. The social media. So overall, I should say that in Kinshasa, we found that those adolescents watched the most television. Whereas you can see here, this is about social media, and you can see Flanders here really stood out in terms of having the most highest proportion of adolescents that were involved in social media. But there were differences, sex differences in these other sites. And we can see here that when we looked at where we saw these differences and how they were different, it seemed to appear to be related to access to social media. So In contexts where access was more universal, we saw that girls had much more greater use of technology. Whereas in sites where technology was a little bit less, most adolescents didn't have access to social media, or it was more limited. Boys reported then greater use, and that's, as you can see, true in Kinshasa and Cuenca. So next slide. Turning to the school, here we really concentrated not only on their connectedness to school, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but also what their aspirations were. And interesting, and across all the sites, most adolescents expect to attend higher education, so post-high school education. We also saw that adolescents across the sites felt very connected to their teachers. There was one exception, though, and that was Flanders, and only about a third of adolescents felt cared for by their teachers. When we asked our colleagues there to explain, they thought it could be related to the fact that in the schools where the adolescent samples were selected from, teachers tended to rotate, and they may not have had a connection as much as the other sites. The other thing that I mentioned before, if you go back, is that we see that girls in Shanghai, Flanders, and Indonesia all expected to complete more school compared to boys. And when we asked their perceptions about caregivers, we saw a similar trend in Shanghai and Indonesia as well. Flanders, they were not asked that question. Now you can go to the next slide. So then we go to the neighborhood. And just to let you know, in the United States, the neighborhood has been shown to have an independent effect on a number of adolescent health behaviors and outcomes. But less is known about how the neighborhood really operates outside of the United States and in high income countries. And here we see kind of a complex picture. First of all, it's important to say that the majority of adolescents in our sites did perceive that their neighborhoods were safe. They were socially cohesive, meaning that they trusted the neighbors, and they felt that there was a high level of social support, meaning if there was something wrong in the neighborhood, they felt that people would intervene. But there were some striking gender and site differences. So you can see we have, at least in the journal article, not shown on here, but we did see that boys in Kinshasa, as well as in Semarang and Densipar, reported greater social cohesion than girls. We saw a different trend in terms of neighborhood safety. So we saw that girls reported feeling safer than boys in Kinshasa and Lampung. And in Flanders, the opposite, you can see was true. And safety has been shown in a number of studies to be an important determinant of adolescent health behaviors. So this just indicates to us that we need to kind of unravel this a little bit more in terms of why we see these differences. Next slide. So basically, taking all of these things into consideration, you can see that there's both similarities and differences in these social contexts. Identifying these variations across the setting may really help us understand how these gender norm perceptions are emerging in boys and girls, given that they do have these different exposures. And then also with these different exposures, and I'm talking especially about the differences that we saw with parental monitoring, with peers, that can also lead to the extent to which boys and girls engage in different health behaviors. So again, this sets the stage for the presentations to come, especially with the next one. So with that, I will let Ben take it away.
Thank you, Christine. And I do agree, it sets the stage perfectly. So what we're going to present in the next few slides are actually the results for two papers that you will find in the special supplement. And these two papers particularly look at, or what I'm going to tell you about, are three objectives. The first is to look at the patterns of gender norms perception across specifically 4 sites. So essentially differences in gender norm perceptions across sites. Then we look at, within one individual's, how consistent are one individual's attitudes or perceptions towards gender norms, and this will become clearer in a couple of slides. And finally, we will look at how adolescents' perception of sexual double standard changed over time, specifically across a one-time period. And we also look at what seems to give us a help us generate hypotheses as to the factors, the developmental and the social factors that are linked to these changes. So moving on to the first question, what are the perception of gender norms across sites? So you see in this slide, essentially are 4 sites. You see 3 graphs, each with 4 data. Each graph represents distribution of gender perception, the mean score of distribution of gender perception from 1 to 5, importantly 5 being the most unequal. So the highest the value, the closer to 5, the more unequal, and obviously 0 being the most equitable, if you like. So 3 graphs, because we have obviously sexual double standard, we have gender stereotypical traits and gender stereotypical roles. You will notice, of course, this is across these 4 sites: Kinshasa, DRC, Shanghai, Cuenca in Ecuador, and data from Indonesia. So there are several patterns, but I just mentioned 2 very quickly. The first is that gender perception differ across sites, which in itself opens up the door to the complexity of measuring gender equality across context. So how equitable is any given individual, would that, as compared to others in their context, might change when we compare that one individual at a global level. So what it means to be gender equitable varies across context. And that's because gender perceptions differ across sites. And you will notice that in our data, they were the least equal in Kinshasa and the most equal in Shanghai. And then we also notice that there is some variation across these 3 dimensions of gender equality. We find that adolescents are more likely to perceive unequal traits than, are more likely to endorse stereotypical traits than stereotypical roles in family decision. And this variation is particularly observable, is particularly evident in Ecuador and Indonesia, and possibly part of the reasons allowing us to explain or interpret these differences that Ecuador and Indonesia are so-called countries in transitions that have recently made significant progress on the UN Gender Inequality Index. So that's kind of the first objective. Then, as I mentioned, we looked at how consistent are within any given individual gender equitable perception. And what we found here is that gender perception not only vary by context and by dimension, but also vary within individuals themselves. So compared to average in-country peers, we find that, as the slide says, 2/3 of adolescents hold more equitable, more equal views in some areas of life, but less equal views in other areas of life. So in layperson terms, this means that any given, most adolescents, any given adolescent in that 2/3 might have very equitable view in one given dimension of gender equality, and yet hold inequitable views in another dimension of gender equality. This is true across sites, and is that kind of dark, kind of middle category, dark but not the darkest green in the graph. However, on the other hand, we also found the opposite with a smaller percentage of 13 to 16% of adolescents in our sample consistently held more egalitarian views across all dimensions, and 20% consistently held less egalitarian views. And then moving on, so we mentioned differences across sites, we mentioned differences within individuals. So what about the longitudinal analysis? I mentioned that we had data at time point 0 and time point 1, and this graph essentially focuses specifically on one dimension. This analysis is having done this analysis presenting the analysis for 3 dimensions would be unnecessarily complicated for the purpose of an objective of the presentation. So we looked specifically, and in the paper as well, at sexual double standards, right? So as you may notice in the graph is that we collected this data in Kinshasa. They had then a second wave of data collected 1 year after so-called baseline. So time 0 and time 1 had a 1 year difference, 1 year gap in data collection. So what did we find? We found that even in this short time period, adolescents tend to be more become more unequitable. So in other words, the perception of the sexual double standard increased both for boys and for girls, but increased more for girls. So now we know that adolescence became more inequitable. What are the factors that we found associated with this increase in the sexual double standard? Well, we found that, well, first of all, we look at developmental factors, and particularly we looked at pubertal onset. We found that adolescents who had not gone through puberty at time one, so all those adolescents who never transitioned to puberty, and those adolescents who transitioned in between the two time points were more likely to increase the sexual double standard. So we're more likely to become more inequitable. And then we also looked at social factors, and particularly at three: peer socialization, caregiver monitoring, and social media, because we wanted to look at the effect that peers, parents, and the social media can have on developing gender inequitable views. And for peer socialization, we found that girls who had little interaction with friends or socialized only with girls experienced greater increase in sexual double standard. Our interpretation here is that it was normative for girls to remain in the house, and so the girls who kind of behaved in a normative way were probably in traditional families and had more time to increase their gender inequitable views. Then we moved on to caregiver monitorings. And what we found instead is that we found an interesting effect for boys. So parents who had less monitoring, the boys who had less monitoring with their parents, again increased sexual double standard. And again, our interpretation is that these families were probably the most traditional. So it was normative for families to kind of worry less about boys, if you allow me the language. So those families who instead spent more time with boys were counter-normative and more likely allowed boys to develop non-traditional views, while instead the families who were less caring or less monitoring boys were more traditional, and this is why we see that boys increase SDS. And then finally, for social media, we found the the boys who had no social media access increased SDS, sexual double standard. So what are the three key takeaways? The first one is that gender norms vary, one, across geography, two, within individuals themselves, and between individuals, which allow to understand the assumption and confirm the assumption that gender system is ubiquitous, but the gender system also manifests itself in ways that can be very incoherent or seemingly incoherent across time, place, or situation. That's why our results challenge the idea that gender equality is a coherent system of beliefs, but is both complex, culturally grounded, and also highly socially influenced in ways that manifest differently across peers and the family. And finally, our results suggest that early adolescent, and especially pre-puberty, is an extremely opportune time to intervene, as perception of gender norms are fluid, but they tend to solidify over time. And puberty seems to be, for some reason, a key moment, both for developmental and possibly social reasons, for adolescents to kind of solidify gender inequitable reasons. We also found that peers and parents are important agents of gender socialization, and they're in different ways for boys and girls, and should be included in gender transformative interventions. Which also set the scene very well for Asha's talk. And so I'll just leave you the floor, Asha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you very much, Kristen, as well. My name is Asta. And as we heard from Kristen and Ben, we see that unequal gender norms are complex. They differ by site, but are important for designing interventions. This presentation will focus on two studies. One study focused on peer violence perpetration in 3 sites in Indonesia, while the second study explored depressive symptoms in 5 sites around the world. Next slide, please. So now I will turn to the first study, which looked at peer violence perpetration. There were 2 objectives for this study. The first objective was to understand the relationship between adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and peer violence perpetration amongst early adolescents in Indonesia. The second objective was to examine if unequal gender norms mediate or moderate the relationship between ACEs and peer violence perpetration. Next slide, please. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, was a combination of 13 questions related to lifetime experience of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. The measure was further categorized from 0 to 4 and more, and peer violence perpetration involved physical violence, so either slapped, hit, or otherwise physically hurt against peers, boys or girls alike, within the last 6 months. What we found was that ACEs, as well as peer violence perpetration, were highly gendered. Out of a total of 2,974 participants, approximately 39% of boys and 28% of girls experienced 4 or more ACEs. Peer violence perpetration was also twice as common amongst boys at 24% in comparison to girls at 12%. Next slide, please. In the graph that you see here, the bars in dark orange are proportions for boys, whereas those in light orange are proportions for girls. When we look at this graph, we see that as history of ACEs increased for both boys and girls, peer violence perpetration also increased. This is particularly marked for boys and girls who experienced 4 or more ACEs. Next slide, please. We also found that adolescents who perceived more unequal gender norms in the form of sexual double standard on the left and gender stereotypical traits on the right were more likely to engage in peer violence perpetration. Boys who perceived a high sexual double standard and gender stereotypical traits in comparison to boys who had more egalitarian views had significantly higher proportion of perpetrating violence. So 30% versus 20% for sexual double standard and 26% versus 21% for gender stereotypical traits. In the bivariate analysis, we found a borderline increase in violence perpetration amongst girls who perceived a high sexual double standard, but the association was no longer significant in the multivariable analysis. Within the multivariable analysis, we found that boys who had more unequal perceptions of sexual double standard had a 46% significantly greater odds of peer violence perpetration in comparison to boys who had more egalitarian perceptions of sexual double standard. Next slide, please. So what are the summary and the implications of this study? We see that boys report greater exposure to adverse childhood experiences, and they also engage in more peer violence perpetration. We also find that both adverse childhood experiences and gender norm perceptions inform violence perpetration amongst boys, suggesting that boys who perceive a more unequal views of sexual double standard may be socialized to conform to traditional masculinity ideology and demonstrate it through violence. Next slide, please. The next presentation that I'm going to be talking about looks at the relationship between gender norms and mental health. The study objectives for this were, one, to understand the extent to which unequal gender norms are linked to depressive symptoms, and the second objective was to look at how much do gender norm perceptions explain the gender divide in depressive symptoms. Next slide, please. The Global Early Adolescent Study included 6 items exploring depressive symptoms, each scored on a 5-point Likert scale. The results presented on the graph represent the summed depressive symptom index ranging from 0 to 24. Results indicate that depressive symptoms are common in this age group and always more frequent amongst girls, with the exception of one site. Next slide, please. We also found that depressive symptoms varied by young people's gender norms perceptions, and specifically the depressive symptom score was higher amongst those who perceived more unequal gender norms in the form of sexual double standard on the right or gender stereotypical traits on the left. And these results were adjusted for potential confounders. On the other hand, we see that adolescents who reported fewer depressive symptoms when they perceived less of a sexual double standard, and then we see that these similars are similar by sex, except in one site in Indonesia. Next slide, please. In the last segment of the analysis, we used path analysis to examine if young people's gender perceptions explained or mediated the sex difference in depressive symptoms we reported previously. The results presented here showed that sexual double standard had a direct effect on depressive symptoms, but had only a modest role in explaining the sex divide in depressive symptoms. Likewise, gender stereotypical traits had a direct effect on depressive symptoms, but did not explain the sex divide. Next slide, please. So what is the summary and the implications of this finding? We see that unequal gender norm perceptions contribute to poor mental health amongst young adolescent boys and girls. We also see that unequal gender norm perceptions partly explain the gender divide in depressive symptoms between girls and boys in early adolescence. I will now hand it to Dr. Blum to continue the next presentation.
Thanks very much, Asla. What we have heard so far is, first of all, the constructs of gender norms, the concept of gender equality, and how these play out with young adolescents is complex. I'd like to just underscore that before I share with you the data on two other papers, because we tend to think about gender equality as a single entity. And what we are seeing through our research is that it is multifaceted, it is complicated, and it does not always work in the direction that we anticipate. So in this presentation, I will focus on two papers where there were paradoxical or unanticipated findings, unanticipated according to what we were thinking we would find. The first is a paper led by our colleague Linnea Zimmerman and a team of researchers from across all of our collaborating sites that looks at the construct of power, and particularly the power to do, or agency. The second is a paper that I had the opportunity to lead, which looks at body satisfaction and body comfort. Let's turn to the first finding, the first paper, which assesses how gender norms relate to power relationships, and specifically to agency, the power to do. The paper is based on a construct that Julie Pulowitz conceptualized of multiple different types of power. Another type of power over others. But this is about agency. And we measured this by voice and decision making. And here we explored the differences by boys and girls based upon data from Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Next, please. So there are two central factors in the study. One is gender equitable or unequal perceptions, and the second is voice and decision making, which is really the power to do, if you will. So what we see here is that in Kinshasa, for sexual double standard and for gender stereotypic traits, we see that girls have more unequal perceptions than boys. And at least for me, this was unanticipated. We see also no difference in gender stereotypic roles, what boys and girls could do. But there is this unequal perception by girls. When we look at the power to do, agency, we see no difference between boys and girls in Kinshasa in decision-making power. But we do see greater difference in voice, and that is boys report greater capacity to express their needs and opinions than do girls. Next, please. So in the analyses that were done, the dimension of agency, this power to do, and perceived gender norms were not strongly correlated. Why does that matter? Well, we tend to think if you increase agency, you're going to increase gender equality. But agency and gender norms, while related, appear to be distinctly different. Secondly, we saw a paradoxical relationship between perceptions of unequal gender norms and agency, such as that the more inequitable were the perceptions, the greater the sense of autonomy. Again, this was not as we anticipated. And this was particularly true for endorsement of sexual double standard. The third, girls who perceived greater gender stereotypic roles had less decision-making power. This is really aligns with the notion that men, not women, should hold the decision-making role within the household. Next, please. So this finding around sexual double standard and decision-making may be unique and culturally based in Kinshasa, or it may be more generalizable. I think that that's a question to be further explored. But what we see is that adolescents who perceive a higher degree of gender inequality, these inequalities do not appear to translate to adolescent boy-girl differences in agency. And programmatically, one cannot assume that increasing girls' empowerment will in itself promote gender equality, nor will promoting gender equality alone translate to empowerment. These both need to be addressed concurrently at the same time. We also need to better understand the relationship between perceived inequality and more agency to see whether there's other geographies and how it plays out. Next slide, please. Let me turn to the second paper, which is on body satisfaction. And here, the objective is really to look at the associations between gender norms and body satisfaction. We focused on 4 geographies: Kinshasa in the DRC, Shanghai in China, Cuenca in Ecuador, in 3 sites, Samarang, Bandar Lampung, and Denpasar in Indonesia, and we combined the 3 sites. Next, please. So what we found was that adolescent perceptions of body satisfaction vary substantially by context. If you look at the graph on the right side, what we see is that there is no difference between boys and girls in body satisfaction in either Cuenca or in Kinshasa. We also see body satisfaction for both boys and girls highest in Kinshasa and second highest in Cuenca. Third, what we see here is that in both of our Asian continent sites, in Shanghai and in Indonesia, we see a significant difference in body satisfaction, with boys having greater body satisfaction than do girls in both of those sites. Next slide, please. We also found that greater body satisfaction was endorsed by those who had more conventional gender stereotypic traits and roles. This was especially true for traits where the differences were significant at least the 0.01 level. And it was greater for both boys and girls in every site except Cuenca, which is to say the endorsement of these more inequitable norms were associated with greater body satisfaction. There is also a positive association of body satisfaction in all of our sites with health status. The healthier one reported themselves to be, the greater their body satisfaction, being normal weight and height. And additionally, in both Asian sites, talking with someone regarding pubertal development was associated with greater body satisfaction. We did not find this in the other sites. Next, please. So when we look across both of these studies, what we come away with and interpret is that challenging conventional gender norms is not always comfortable and is reflected in the findings from both of these two papers. Whether this reflects the measures that we use, the cultural contexts of the settings where the research was done, or more cross-cutting processes has yet to be determined. But it does raise issues and considerations for us. While increased agency is a positive goal, and while increasing body satisfaction, especially for girls, is a positive goal, one cannot assume that increasing one and focusing only on one will in fact translate to increasing, for example, body comfort. You have to think about each of these related but separately. Thank you very much. And let me now turn it back to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Bob. And actually, I'm going to turn it to Elizabeth for some concluding remarks before we open it for Q&A.
Thank you, Carolyn. The Global Early Adolescence Study is really a groundbreaking series of studies in a number of different ways. We know gender norms are a major influence on how we all experience the world, and that this in turn influences health and well-being. And that early adolescence is a key developmental moment when gender norms intensify as they shape young people's attitudes and behaviors as they move toward adulthood and their independent place in society. Most of the research before this study about gender norms and roles and how they unfold during early adolescence has previously been conducted predominantly in global North countries in Europe and North America, and predominantly among middle class or affluent families. Yet the majority of young people today live in the global South, and we know that young people live in a variety of contexts, including urban poor areas. The diversity of countries that are involved in this study really contributes to the strength of the findings. A major achievement of this collaboration has been the creation of these developmentally appropriate measures of gender equitable attitudes and gender stereotypes and the sexual double standards that are relevant, for very young adolescents throughout the world. Because these tools end up being important for researchers to be able to understand how gender norms and behaviors and health unfold during early adolescence. The studies that were shared briefly today, and I highly recommend that you read the full articles in the special supplement of the Journal of Adolescent Health, show that those unequal gender norms and stereotypes and sexual double standards exist in each of the different country contexts to varying degrees. Throughout places as diverse as low-income settings in cities in China, Indonesia, Ecuador, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these gender norms reinforce gender inequalities among adolescents, especially for girls. Whether the intensification of these unequal gender norms during early adolescence is a continuation of even earlier gender socialization in societies, or it's an abrupt social change that happens at puberty, these unequal norms often contribute to poorer health, as been shown in these studies, and it may help explain some of the shifting health disparities between genders that happen during the early teen years. They demonstrate that gender matters, but that gender norms operate in complex ways in influencing young people. And they may even vary within the same person across different contexts of their world. For all young people and the adults who work with them and care about them, these papers offer some compelling evidence that interventions are needed at the individual, community, and societal levels to address unequal gender norms as one step toward improving gender equality and reducing some of the different health effects across genders. With these new measures around perceived gender norms for young adolescents, researchers can now evaluate the effectiveness of such interventions in how they help change norms, how they help change gender equality, and how they continue to improve adolescent health. Congratulations to the investigators of these really intriguing and fascinating studies. I look forward to seeing the further work that is done within this global early adolescent study. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And so now we have a number of questions that have come up during the different presentations. And I'm just going to start off with one question that relates to the measures themselves and give a little more context about how the measures were developed, just kind of as an introduction. So those three measures of gender perceptions were developed with formative research, qualitative research in 14 sites across the globe. And we asked young people between the ages of 11 and 13 to reflect on gender transition from childhood to adolescence, kind of describing their transitions from being a child to an adolescent and how that experience was different for boys and girls. We also engaged parents in this conversation and asked them how it might be different to raise a boy or a girl. And through those interviews, we found some kind of common themes that emerged and laid the grounds for developing those measures. They were subsequently tested in a pilot study that was conducted across these 14 sites. And there's actually a publication that reflects kind of the development of those scales if you're interested. So now I'm going to turn it to Ben, because there are a number of questions that relate to Ben's presentations around how concepts of perception versus endorsement of the sexual double standard, and how to understand the increase in Kinshasa. And then another question also related to that study about potential differences in wealth and education of parents, and how that relates to increases in the sexual double standard. So Ben, you have the mic.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for the questions. I might actually need your help with Deborah's question. I think because I think Deborah's question is this a two-part question? Because I saw her, she typed later on, sorry, my question escaped before I finished. So Deborah, thanks for clarifying. So the question of the anonymous attendees, did the perception of the sexual double SDS increase or the endorsement of the SDS increase? So the SDS, and I don't know, Caroline, if it's helpful to bring back your slide with the different measures. The SDS is not a single measures, but is a series of measures that are derived and that are gathered under the term sexual double standards. And these measures include a variety of variables, and they are how adolescents responding to these, whether the extent to which they agree with the following 6 points. Adolescent boys who goes into having sex, adolescent girls should avoid boys because they trick them into having sex, adolescent boy who is interest, etc., etc. Boys have girlfriend. So it's kind of, I will say, it's a mix of both in a way. It's the endorsement that the individual has, which is obviously related in an inextricable way to the way what the individual believes to be the normality in their community. I don't know, Caroline, if you want to add anything, because you also work with me on this.
Sure. I think, it's difficult at that particular stage of development. We actually tried to, in the formative work, to ask young people their own attitudes and reflect on their friends' attitudes. And that was piloted initially. And what we found is actually young people didn't make that distinction between themselves and their peers, and also had a lot of difficulty in assessing what their peers thought. So it's unclear if they're endorsing those views or if they're reflecting on what's the descriptive norm or the subjective norm in their communities. I think we will have more clarity as young people grow older around kind of the distinction between their own attitudes and their perceptions of what's the general norm in their communities. Thanks, Ben. So I think there are a number of questions that relate to body satisfaction. So maybe I want to turn it to Bob, and actually Sam has question for you. Really interesting results related to body satisfaction and norms. Have you looked into the importance of norms at the site level as opposed to the individual level as they relate to satisfaction? The presence of unequal norms may still lead to negative self-perceptions among very young adolescents who individually hold more progressive views.
Yes, so we do have comparative data by site, and I touched on some of that, but it is presented in the paper. What we have not done, and I think your question is, have we looked at the mean level of body satisfaction by site and individual body satisfaction and the distance between the two? That said, we do know that one of the issues, and it has programmatic implications, I think, is that when someone, particularly an adolescent and a young person, is out of sync with the prevailing mean, the group average, it is uncomfortable for them. And that would hold true for a progressive as well as for a regressive or conservative point of view. And I think that some of the discomfort that we're seeing with adolescence and body satisfaction is that the mean of the community, both the peer and the adult community, is dysynchronous. Back to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Bob. And I'm seeing one question from Deborah around the findings of the paper on perceptions of gender equality and agency. They're very intriguing indeed. And Deborah was wondering if it was problematic to equate agency with empowerment. Agency is only one dimension of empowerment, which includes structural as well as perceptual and behavior. So I might reflect on that one, and I absolutely agree. Initially, we had labeled those measures as empowerment, and there were 3 dimensions: voice, decision-making, and freedom of movement. In the paper specifically, Linnea Zimmerman is addressing voice and decision-making, but I think those measures really relate more to agency than the overall concept of empowerment. And one of the kind of next steps in this investigation is to look at how agency relates to young people's resources and how their sense of agency changes over time, and what might be the drivers of those changes. And we will very much look at access to resources in relation to those measures. Just to point out that we didn't find many gender differences in those measures of voice and decision making at that early stage of adolescence. We will track those gender differences over time, but we did find substantial differences in freedom of movement between boys and girls, where boys have much more freedom of movement than girls, and that is treated in subsequent analyses that are ongoing, looking at freedom of movement and violence perpetration as an example. So stay tuned, much more to come around the concepts of agency and how it relates to young people's access to resources for boys and girls alike.
May I make just one brief additional comment here, and that is that the comment is absolutely on target. What is problematic, I would suggest, is that programmatically, often, agency and empowerment are used synonymously, and interventions are aimed at increasing agency more than, for example, increasing opportunity structure. And we know that empowerment involves both the capacity to make change and the opportunity to accomplish that. So the point that is made by Deborah, I believe, is spot on target, but programmatically should be really thought about as we move forward.
Thanks, Bob. And just kind of clarifying questions about the sampling, because obviously in this time frame we had little time to go over the methods. But so we are focusing on urban poor adolescents, and these are not representative samples of the settings in which we were. Most of the sampling procedures were based on school-based sampling, except in Kinshasa, where we also included an out-of-school group, because the proportion of young people who were out of school in these poor neighborhoods in Kinshasa was much higher than in other sites. So in terms of generalizability of these findings, I think what we can reflect on is kind of the commonalities and differences that we're seeing across sites, but definitely those results are among convenient sample and shouldn't be generalized, for instance, to adolescents who might be living in more affluent communities or in rural communities. We would need to extend this research to look at how both gender norms are perceived in different communities and also how they affect the behaviors and the outcomes for adolescents. And with that, we are just on the hour. Sorry, we couldn't address all your questions. I really engage you to read the papers, and we're looking forward to moving this work forward. We have much more to come, especially as a number of sites have included interventions and gender transformative interventions. And so we're evaluating the benefits of investing in young people to promote gender equality. So thank you all, and especially a great thanks to all our presenters and Elizabeth, and have a great day.